from the point of view of the human sciences, the question of self and society is really an almost canonical question. I mean, every paradigmatic interest reflects on the relationship between self and society. There is, however, until recently, and before the rise of the disciplinary society, one thing missing in this canonical interaction between self and society, and that is the relationship to anything religious, spiritual, theological, or transcendent. The disciplinary focus on the dynamic of the self in relation to some collective has left out any reflection on any level of experience that William James would have called the more. So we're going to talk a little bit here today about self and society, but in relation to spirituality. And I think it's a very good start that we start with Jeff Kripal and the garden next door.
In the fall of 2015, I was working on the historian of religions and Romanian literary figure Mircea Eliade, and in particular on his Youth Without Youth. His last novella that Francis Ford Coppola made into a film by the same name a few years ago. The story begins with an aging and depressed academic named Dominic Mattei, who is on his way to commit suicide when he is struck by lightning on Easter night behind a church in the rain while he holds an umbrella. As Dominic heals in the hospital, he grows mysteriously younger. His old teeth fall out and new ones take their place. His skin grows young. The female nurses marvel and giggle at his body's reaction when they bathe him. But the lightning strike has brought more than youth. It has brought strange new powers. Dominic dreams little snippets that play out the next day. He begins to manifest all sorts of new capacities, including telekinesis and the ability to absorb books by simply passing his hand over them. Every aging academic's dream. He begins to wonder whether he might be some kind of mystical mutant. So this is the novella now. Sometimes after he had begun work at the library, he experienced a long dramatic dream. There was one detail in particular he remembered. In the aftermath of his electrocution by lightning, his mental activity anticipated somewhat the condition men will attain some tens of thousands of years hence. In short, I'm a mutant, he said to himself on awakening. I anticipate the post-historic existence of man. Like in a science fiction novel, he added, smiling with amusement. About the same time that I was working on this novella, in October of 2015, I met Elizabeth Krohn. We met around a symposium on near-death experiences in the Houston Medical Center, to which I was asked to respond. Elizabeth's story beats at the heart of this lecture. Allow me to introduce it with a historical trace, a photograph taken just before she herself was transformed into a mystical mutant. This photograph was taken in haste on September 2nd, 1988. Elizabeth's husband was away on business. Immediately after this photograph was snapped by an automatic camera, Elizabeth got her two boys, Andy and Jeremy, in the car and rushed to her Houston synagogue, Congregation Emmanuel, which happens to be just across the street from Rice University, not 3 blocks from my office. Elizabeth was attending a service in honor of the first anniversary of the death of her beloved paternal grandfather, Jean-Albert Duval. Although the sun was shining over Houston, it was raining in this neighborhood. She got out of the car. She was holding an umbrella in one hand and the little hand of her 2-year-old son, Andy, in the other. She was conscious of the rain and her clothes. She had, after all, just spent an inordinate amount of money on new clothes and some very expensive shoes. Indeed, they were so expensive that she hid the bill and the items from her husband. She had no idea why she bought something so extravagant, so beautiful. Then it struck her. literally, the lightning. She kept walking anyway, right into the synagogue. She realized, though, that something was not quite right. She looked down and noticed that her feet were floating a few inches off the ground. She looked back into the parking lot and saw her body lying in the rain and her 2-year-old screaming his head off. His little eardrums had burst. Her beautiful new shoes were fried, and the umbrella was still on fire in the rain. An extremely elaborate near-death experience followed that involved a moving conscious light, a speechlessly beautiful garden, and fantastically colored alien landscape with multiple moons or planets, a sense of absolute unconditional love, skin grown young and perfect, and a long telepathic conversation with an invisible presence whom she experienced as her grandfather, but whom she suspected was really God. He told her that if she chose to go back, she would have a daughter, a future soul who had already chosen her as her mother. Her total experience on the alien planet lasted 2 weeks. Here on Earth, it lasted at most 2 minutes. I will not get into all of the details of the NDE, as these are extremely elaborate and possess, as such details often do, deep taproots into her personal past and childhood. We are presently working on a book together about her childhood and adolescence, her early adult life, her near-death experience, and the multiple religious teachings and experiences that emerged from it. These teachings, or what she likes to call these lessons, include, number 1, a firm conviction in the reality of human immortality. As she puts it, we do not die. Secondly, the seeing of glowing colored lights, or what she calls auras, around the human body. This is kind of a regular occurrence for her. Third, the presence of a divine double or angelic guide with whom each soul eventually merges after many lives. And finally, the spiritual process of transmigration or reincarnation toward this same angelicization of the human. Each of these lessons of the garden next door, as we call it, finds deep precedence in the Jewish mystical traditions, including the angelic mentor or Magid and the centrality of transmigration or Gilgul. I will return to some of these phenomena at the end of my hour lecture, but I mostly want to focus on a single bright effect of the lightning strike, namely the fact that shortly after this strike, Elizabeth's life was turned inside out by the appearance of psychical capacities. As Elizabeth recovered from the lightning strike, she had to stay in bed because her feet were horribly burned. She slept a lot. She began to notice that she would sometimes have a crystal clear dream or nightmare of an event that would then play out on the next day's news. But nightmare is not the right word here. Elizabeth insists that these were not dreams at all. She uses the word only because our English language has no other. Some of the most dramatic were extremely specific visions of plane crashes, tsunamis, and earthquakes. I'm going to summarize just 2 of these for you. Eventually, by the way, she learned to send herself time-stamped emails immediately after the nightmare, so that when the event would appear in the news, she would have the time-stamped email and the event. And this was mostly just to convince herself that she wasn't going crazy. She was very concerned about all of this. So here's the first one. This dream vision took place on January 15th, 2009. Elizabeth and her second husband, Matt, were vacationing in Jerusalem. They had just returned from a day of touring the city. They were exhausted and laid down to take a nap before dinner. Within a few minutes, Elizabeth was up out of the bed and writing herself a time-stamped email. She had had one of those nightmares. Here is the actual email. I have only changed the email address to protect her privacy. It reads simply, mid-sized commercial passenger jet, 80 to 150 people, crashes in New York City, maybe in River, not Continental Airlines, not American Airlines. It's an American carrier like Southwest or U.S. Airways. Note that this email was sent from Jerusalem at 2:57 p.m. Israel Standard Time. This was 8:57 a.m. Eastern Standard Time in New York. The plane went down 6.5 hours later at 3:27 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The detail is not in the email, but Matt has verified for me that Elizabeth said to him after she awoke that she saw people standing on the wings of the plane. They both remember this detail very clearly because Matt immediately responded that it made no sense. How can people stand on the wing in a plane crash? But it made perfect sense. This, after all, was the famous Hudson River emergency landing of U.S. Airways Flight 1549, piloted by the now legendary Captain Sully. There were 150 passengers and 5 crew members aboard the plane for a total of 155 survivors. So she was just 5 off with her number range. There were 100 injuries, 5 of them serious, but none were fatal. The second dream I want to relate occurred in the early morning of February 2nd, 2015. Elizabeth woke up and emailed this note to herself. Passenger plane with propellers. Plane is white, foreign airline, maybe Asian. Crashes in a big metropolitan city right after takeoff. Right wing of plane is pointed straight up before crashing. Most on board killed, but some survivors. The dream vision occurred about a day and a half before the actual crash. On February 4th, 2015, Trans-Asia Airways Flight 235 crashed soon after takeoff. There were 43 fatalities and 15 survivors. A dashcam video stunningly caught the crash in process. The right wing is pointed straight up as the propeller plane strikes a cab on the highway and crashes into the Keelung River near Taipei, Taiwan. This famous picture of the crash in process is exactly the image Elizabeth saw in her precognitive dream. Now, I can't get into the analysis here, but one of the things that I immediately suspected when I encountered these dreams was that the precognition was not about the actual historical event. It was about her witnessing the event on the news or in the media. In other words, what I think is going on here is she's precognizing her own brain, cognizing the image on the global media the next day. Because her visions are too precise. They're too exactly like the photograph that appeared in the news the next day. I can't go into all that right now, but that's what I think is actually happening here. I know what some of you may have been thinking. You may be thinking that reincarnation, auras, and paranormal powers are the stuff of New Age nonsense. You want to explain Elizabeth away by locating her in a particular historical context. You want to explain her by historicizing her. Be careful. History is much weirder than that. Are Elizabeth's allegedly Jewish experiences and beliefs simply a reflection of modern New Age sensibilities? Let me query the question. What assumptions are being made here? The first assumption being made is that the Jewish traditions and the New Age are unrelated. Here we have to be more historical. We have to recognize that both the human potential movement of the 1960s and 70s and the New Age movement of the 80s and 90s were profoundly shaped by Jewish figures and intellectuals. And I have a whole list here which I don't need to read. We also have to recognize that the presence of Jews within contemporary American Buddhist communities is so obvious and so important that it has merited a new moniker, the Jew-Boo. As all of this gives witness, much of the New Age is very Jewish, and much of modern Judaism is very New Age. The two should not be facilely separated then, as if they were unrelated phenomena. They are not. There are other assumptions being made in the observation that Elizabeth's experiences must somehow be a modern New Age construction, materialist and historicist assumptions. The assumption here is that any belief or experience must be the result of some material event, some physical text or social influence. But is this true? It is certainly true that the present shape of reincarnation and the language of auras in Elizabeth's thought and experience owe a good deal to 19th and 20th century theosophy and New Age strands. The language of auras is indeed largely theosophical, even if their roots lie in much deeper Neoplatonic sources and strands. But it does not follow that the seeing of auras is somehow dependent on any of these literatures. Consider a man I will simply call Isaac. Isaac routinely asked dead and future souls for knowledge of the future, just as Elizabeth did in her near-death experience. Isaac could also discern the thoughts of individuals even before they were carried out. That is, he was what we would today call telepathic. Much like Elizabeth again, Isaac saw what he called lights, or a fire burning around people's skin and bodies, particularly in their hair around the head or just above the head. Isaac would also read this external aura, as his biographer has it, and recognize in it both the good and evil inclinations that accompanied the person. According to one of Isaac's interpreters, this was, quote, the astral or psychic body that serves to mediate between the body and the lowest aspects of the soul. Perhaps most significantly, Isaac was convinced of the reality of reincarnation. He in fact believed he was a reincarnation of a famous ancient rabbi whom Jewish tradition identified as the historical source of the Zohar. He could even discern the past lives or reincarnations of individuals he met or taught. He thought that once a soul was sufficiently purified and perfected, it would cease to transmigrate, much as we have it in the Buddhist and Hindu traditions with their doctrines of karma, samsara, and moksha. Telling the future, reading minds, seeing auras, telling people about their past lives, identifying with a famous religious figure from the past. Obviously, Isaac is a New Age author. Nope. This is Isaac Luria, otherwise known as the Ari. In his last years, Luria was the charismatic leader of a mystical fellowship in the Galilean city of Shvat, a place that, as Lawrence Fine has described, was the very center of Jewish mystical life at this period. And I don't need to go on to tell you who Luria was, because obviously you all know. Normally in a normal audience, I have to explain who Luria was. I'm not going to do that. But here's my point. Elizabeth Crone describes out-of-body experiences, occult events, and esoteric visions in contemporary Houston that are phenomenologically indistinguishable from the textual descriptions of Isaac Luria's. I could take any number of sentences or paragraphs from Lawrence Fine's biography of Luria and just plop them in Elizabeth's own descriptions of what she's seeing or experiencing, and you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. This, I should suggest, should have major repercussions on how we think about the past. Once we acknowledge such clear resonances, can we really continue to speak and write, as scholars do, of miracle stories as, quote, easily identifiable folk motifs, of being burdened with hagiography, and of communities promoting, quote, the illusion of special power, unquote, of their charismatic prodigies? Should not our personal encounter with the paranormal present change our scholarly encounter with the miraculous and magical past? Final section. Lawrence Fine has written of Shvat and its mysteries. I can attest to that. When I hinted at some of these historical resonances, Elizabeth did something quite surprising. She is always surprising me. She observed that her paternal family traces its roots back to Shvat. She also shared with me that her paternal great-great-grandfather, pictured here, is buried just a few feet from Luria himself in the cemetery just outside of Shvat. The family believes that this same great-great-grandfather played some role in bringing the Chabad movement from Russia to Israel. Again, I explain what Chabad is, but I probably don't need to do that. Now, I cannot confirm any of these genealogical claims. What I can do is observe how the phenomenological similarities I saw in the present and the past, that is, in Elizabeth Crone and Isaac Luria, quickly morphed into some implicit genetic claims about a family lineage, or what Luria himself would have no doubt called a soul ancestry. Someone, please help me here. What does it mean to write a history of Kabbalah when the phenomenologies of occult experience featured in these traditions are so consistent across centuries of space-time? And what would this same history look like if we took Elizabeth's precognitive dreams about the future and reincarnation convictions about the past, or Isaac Luria's for that matter, as potentially real aspects of the historical world in which we live and about which we are writing? What would become of our neat linear models of time and our Kantian assumptions that we are all locked into some particular historical and cultural moment? What would happen to our notions of embodiment, that is, that we are solely these particular present bodies? Most mysteriously of all, what do we do with the implicit or apparent genetic components of Elizabeth's family lore and the remarkable paranormal gifts that run through her generations? I've only told you a few of the family stories. I did not tell you about the phone call from the dead, the haunted necklace, or the office plant gifted by the beloved grandfather that died instantly on the day he died, or the son who became an Orthodox rabbi in the Chabad movement, or the mother who remembers her previous lives, or the female ghosts both mother and son have seen in their home, and on and on and on we could go. There is no getting around it. This family has spiritual mojo. Can the phenomenological similarities between the experience and teachings of Luria and Elizabeth Crone be reduced to the materiality of genetics? Or can the Jewish mystical doctrine of Gilgul or soul ancestry be read as a religious intuition of the depths of genetic transmission? Is there a biology or genetics of paranormal powers, or are genetics and biology themselves paranormal in nature? Final thoughts. In my conversations with Elizabeth, I could not help but think of Eliade's youth without youth. It seemed too close to her experiences to be real. I lent her my copy. She went home and read it immediately. The next time we met, I asked her what she thought of the book. Her reply was immediate and firm. That's not fiction. It is not difficult to understand her reaction. Like Dominic, Elizabeth had been struck by lightning holding an umbrella behind a religious building and subsequently developed various psychical capacities. In both cases, the cloud or storm was somehow symbolic, since it appeared to be restricted to the small space over the individual. Like Dominic again, one of the first powers to emerge were precognitive dreams. Dominic and Elizabeth also both grew young, Dominic in this world, Elizabeth in the afterlife. They even came to nearly identical conclusions about the presence of the doppelganger, angelic guide or divine double. In Elizabeth's case, the double functions as a kind of angelic twin who guides the soul's journey through its various transmigrations until it finally merges with its guide, realizes its own identity, and returns no more. It is an odd experience reading about yourself in someone else's novel. Thank you very much.